was Dr. George Blake?
Dr. George Blake was known to many in the, I would say, health industry. He was a psychologist, and he was a force in our community, but a much greater icon than I knew him as. I simply knew him as George. And George was a storyteller and a musician, an artist in his own right. And I met him actually at a mutual friend's funeral in about 1992. And he slid over and recognized me for having worked at the Whitby Public Library. And that's how our conversation began. And he asked me, "Do you tell stories in your job?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And that is what began a relationship of connecting storytelling and me with George. After I met George, he would saunter into the library. I was working at the Whitby Public Library quite often. We had him as a performer. I was still learning to tell stories, although I had performed them in the core programming of my job with children. But George was really encouraging, and when I went to the group and I started to perform out with the group over the years, George became a friend, and everyone who knew him would say he was a friend, and he was. He was a genuine, authentic friend to everyone. And for me personally, as I said, as time went on and I, realized that he was so close to my own father's age, and being a psychologist, he had some wise words, and unrelated to storytelling, just, talking about life. And he would always help whoever he was talking to. I guess you might say, always look on the bright side of life. George always saw that, regardless of what you're going through. And, I think myself and many people who met George in their life would have benefited from his wise words. I guess reflective of being a Buddhist monk and a psychologist, but also a storyteller and an honest individual. He was an advocate, of course, for storytelling, and that all started in Toronto back in the early 70s. Dan Yashinsky, Celia Lottridge, some very, very astute people began the movement of storytelling in the city of Toronto. And George was one who was driving back and forth from Durham region. In fact, he did that right up, until he was probably in his late 80s. He would go into 1001 Friday nights of storytelling. So George was one of the people behind storytelling who really promoted and advocated this oral tradition, which is very important because we learn about each other and from each other through our stories. And traditional stories in particular, they're just filled with the then and the now. We can compare, how people lived then and how we live now. And so he was a founder of Storytellers of Canada. And in 1993, I had known him for a while, and we traveled to Montreal, and that was the very first session of storytelling for Storytellers of Canada. And he was always joking, always teasing. I remember one of the concerts that we had on, and we didn't charge any money, but he went around to the audience with his hand out. "Have you got any money? Have you got any money? Have you got?" And people were putting $5 in his hand. And kind of thought, what are you doing, George? So he just laughed at the end because he had this pot full of money, and that's how he started his story. He gave it all back.
You stated that George had a great sense of telling oral stories. Where do you think he got that from?
Oh, definitely from growing up in his homeland of Jamaica. I think during the course of his career as a psychiatrist, he was also, as you saw in the documentary, in World War II in the army. He was a meteorologist. All of this background of life, he brought to the forefront in his stories, and became a lover of bringing this oral tradition back into community. So he really concentrated on keeping those older stories alive, but he also brought in a lot of newness, a lot of interesting tidbits about his own life. And one of the things that actually it just came to me recently, my father too was in World War II, and he too was in the Air Force. And the fact that George would be 99 this year. My father would be 100. And I thought, I wonder if they met, because George trained in Scotland. My father was from Scotland. Unlikely, but that's, these are the kinds of stories that culminate and come about when you meet someone who's lived such a rich life. And George did. And he often told us about his home life and the stories, the storytelling in the evening and the neighbors telling stories. So I think that's where he got most of his, desire to continue telling the stories. Yeah.
What are some of George's favorite stories that he loved telling?
Well, I know for sure that Jakarta tales, and I hope I say it right because he actually gave me a full lesson, Jakarta tales. And these were based on Buddhism. And he told a lot of those tales. And one of the stories that he insisted when we started our project together, which you'll probably ask me about a little later, in archiving his voice, is a story called The Blossom Tree. And that is recorded on the archive CD, which I'll show you the CD here. So this is a CD that we put together after George passed away. And but he and I were collecting, whatever we could live, and unfortunately passed away. And that's when I was allowed permission to go into his home, and some of the tapes that he had, and these old little discs, had them transcribed, and The Blossom Tree was on there. That's one of his favorite, I think.
I know that George, as you mentioned before, knew how to play music, and he taught you how to play a special song about the Caribbean. Do you mind giving us a little taste?
Okay, so I play guitar, but it's very simple. And I always, I'm a songwriter as well. But one afternoon, George and I were at his place, and he, of course, made his own djembe drums, and we'd just kind of hang out, and he'd play his drum, and I'd play my guitar. And then he said, I used to play a classic guitar, but I can't. My fingers are a little arthritic. And I said, oh. And he said, do you know a calypso beat? And I said, well, I've never tried it. So he said, you just take the one finger. And of course, George had these very long, beautiful fingers, and he swept it across. And I practiced all day, all night, Marianne, down by the seaside sifting sand. All the little children love Marianne, down by the seaside sifting sand. I just played that little bit, but that's what George taught me. And so I did write a song, my own song, When the Winter Comes. And that's a children's song. And it's a lot of fun. It's so simple. 3 chords. And he often played his drum just as an intro to many of the concerts that we put on in the community through Durham Storytellers and Storytelling Toronto, wherever we went. And he and I did a couple of shows on our own as well. So we always started off with a bit of music to draw the audience in, yeah.
Do you also mind sharing one of George's stories?
I guess if I were to think about one of the stories that, you know, I may have learnt from him, it would be the blossom tree, and one that I'm going to think about telling, you know, in the future in his honor. And that's something I'd have to go back to. And
when and why did George decide to find the Durham Folklore Society?
Yes, and that was the former name. Now it is simply the Durham Storytellers. The history goes back to 1990, and there were just a handful. If you look at the website for Durham Storytellers, a handful that began the storytelling group in our community. And of course, George was the initiator. And that, I think, was reflective of his time that he spent in Toronto with Storytelling Toronto, which I don't even think it was Storytelling Toronto then. I think it might have been 1001 Friday Nights, which is now separate from the actual, you know, Storytelling Toronto school. And meeting other storytellers and being involved with Storytellers of Canada, he felt our community could really benefit from having a storytelling, you know, group where people from all different cultures, the diversity, would come together and tell stories. And I found most are librarians or teachers, but in the recent years, we've seen much more integration of stories, other than just traditional. There's personal and you know, poetry and music, of course, has always been a big part. And George was one who really, you know, felt it necessary, and I agree. I agree with him.
What is your greatest memory of George?
Well, I guess if I have to think about that for a minute. It has to be more recent, I think, because over the years I was working and I didn't see him often until, and he retired, by the way, when he really took up storytelling. He was a photographer, as you saw in the video. He started a photography group. He really got into the arts. And I was still working at the library when I met him. So I didn't see him as often, nor did I get to many of the meetings. But when I was able to be, you know, more with him and with the group, we got to know each other better. And so I'd say when we became friends in more recent years before he passed away, my most wonderful memory, and I wish I would have had my audio recorder on. I feel sick about it. We were in his living room and he was talking about his childhood in Jamaica. And he was beginning, you know, he was an elder. He was close, like 94 at the time. And he was laying on the ground and he was stretched out and he was just talking about his life. And I just remember, just feeling enveloped by all of this background about him. And he talked a lot about food, a lot about the food. And one of the most wonderful things he said was, when you walk out the door when I was a boy, I guess this is one of the things that I remember well about him. If you walk down the street or a pathway, he said, and you don't say good morning to so-and-so, if you don't say good morning to Mrs. So-and-so, or you don't say good morning, he said, we called a lot of neighbors grandmother and grandfather and brother, and, he said we were just all family. And he said, you would get a smack across the head. So he was very demonstrative and very, he would tell these things and giggle about it. But that was the realistic, part about him, is that he no holds bar. He would tell you like it was, and he really, you can envision this, this little boy, and this community. So it was very endearing, very endearing.
So, what can you say is the legacy of the late Honorable Dr. B. George Blake / George Blake, as you know him as? What is his legacy?
Well, I don't think I have to think what his legacy is, because it is all written down now. It's all documented, and his legacy, aside from storytelling, of course, is the work he did in his career as a psychologist, and he left a mark, in this community as a force, and especially as a Black man. And he talked about that. This was very important to him, because when he came to Canada and he settled, in the community, he said there weren't any others like him. And I said to him, did you feel you had to prove yourself? And he said, no, I already proved myself because I was invited. I was invited to come and do this work. And he was working on, how to treat alcoholism and drug use. And he was the one who brought the Pinewood Center to our community. We didn't have anything like that. And so that's a big legacy. His office that he used to work in has been renamed to the Dr. B. George Blake. It's their boardroom. And I was fortunate enough to go to that opening along with several people in the community, several dignitaries and friends from from the Durham Storytellers, those who began the Durham Storytellers with him. So that's that part of him. And then the second, the biggest legacy I know him is definitely his joy in giving of himself. He gave, I found this out much later, meditation classes in Ajax. I can't remember the name of the place now. All free. He did this from his heart. He was a Buddhist monk at one time, and this was his gift. And of course, the legacy of the storytelling community. We would never have had the community of storytellers. And the artists that met him over the years, each and every one of us have developed even further because of George. He was very encouraging, and he was the type of man that would say, if you were nervous, and I remember just before a performance in a cafe, I was nervous, and he said, just go and look in the mirror and look at yourself and say, you're good, and remember when you did a really good job. He said, always never go to what you did wrong or what could go wrong. Always go to where you did a great job and you felt good, and before you perform, and be prepared. So in everything he did, you know, he prepared himself. He also, you know, taught drumming Club Carib to children. I don't think he charged anything for that. But his gift in the community was just George being everywhere. He was at every event, supporting, you know, other artists and musicians and storytellers. And he was very prolific in continuing to advocate for the stories over the years that are very important to remember. And Harriet Tubman was one of them. And again, like, I'm going to promote this, but it's not for sale. It's actually archived at the Oshawa Museum and also on Storytellers of Canada Radio, SCC, Radio CC. The collection is there, and you just have to click in and you can hear. But he did, you know, a full stage show of Harriet Tubman and toured that. And I was fortunate enough to find that on, you know, on one of these little guys and have it transcribed. And there was a lot of editing, lots and lots of editing. There were babies crying and everything, but it turned out beautifully. And he also wrote, I can't remember exactly all the titles, I'll give them to you later, but he wrote, you know, books based on his Buddhist way of living, you know, about Zen and such. And this one play, Keapora Cave, it's a dedication to women down the ages. And there's a lot of history in this. And I remember when George did his very last show of this, he wept. It was very, very dear to his heart to you know, remember the past, go forward, but never forget, you know, the journey that he says his people, you know, Black culture, people have gone through. And so he was very good and very adamant at keeping this part of history alive and teaching us, you know, teaching us. So he became a very dear, dear friend. And near the end, we communicated quite a bit. He was very excited about collecting, you know, someone wanting to collect stories. And that actually culminated, I should have brought that up, because Storytellers of Canada has a program called Story Save. And myself and one of his friends and a colleague, Mickey Beck, who was one of the original members as well, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could submit a proposal or a nomination to have George's storytelling archived. Well, actually, it wasn't archived at the time. It would have been live in a studio. And if you go on and look about Story Save, there's a lot of fundraising for an individual to go into a studio, and there's a team that works with the storyteller. But George was aging, and he was a little forgetful, and it was too much for him to think about going into a studio. So he was declined as a nominated person for Story Save, but I said to him, George, what if we do it together? And that's when myself and George and Mickey Beck helped out with some of the, you know, choosing of material. And Stephen Frank did the design for George's CD. And he is the one who worked with me on all the shaping, you know, of the CD and how it would be presented. So this is the cover that he did, which is awesome. There's the Harriet Tubman. And our radio producer at the time, the manager, David Merlot, was very instrumental in the editing of the stories. Once I selected them and did my little bit of editing, he further edited. So there's a lot of backstory, and Stephen Frank actually just called me out of the blue before Dr. B. George Blake passed away. He called me in the fall and just said, hey, I've been thinking about George. Is he still around? And I said, oh, yes. And I told him about our project. And he offered to jump on board. And he took George out for a very last time for an arts celebration. And then we lost George in January. So it just, communication tumbled through the community about him. And of course, we all connected, and it was months of celebrating George Blake. A gallery of stories was actually at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. And For the Love of George was at the Club Carib in Oshawa. And that was a partnership with Club Carib and with Durham Storytellers. And that was a fabulous event. People came in from Toronto who knew George in the storytelling community and beyond. And I believe we had close to 100 people attend. And his former theater group, Callaloo, there were still members that came on board and sang and danced. It was marvelous. And we had a feature teller in Diane Chandler, a longtime member of Durham Storytellers. Our group members went up on stage and did a segment together. And we had George's dear friend Rita Cox, who is also an elder in the African Canadian community. So it was a tremendously powerful event, and we really did celebrate a wonderful man and learned a lot about him. And he was also featured for Art in the Hall at the City Hall. Then I met, another very influential person who worked with him, Dr. Leroy Clark, who was advocating at City Hall to have the Pinewood Center named after George Blake, Dr. B. George Blake, and it ultimately became the boardroom. So I could go on and on. It was just one, succession after another of celebrations of him.
Now, tiger is an African creature. And so Anansi was always playing tricks on Tiger. So one day, Tiger was in the forest looking for Anansi and asking the animals, have you seen Anansi? No. Another, have you seen? No, no. But Tiger kept looking for Anansi. And then, as he walked about, he saw Anansi sitting on a high rock, looking down into a pool. So he crept up behind Anansi and he said, Anansi, I've got you now. Anansi turned to him and said, Tiger, don't be so loud. Of course you've got me. I'm not running away from you. But come over here. I want to show you something. So Tiger, because he was so confident that he had Anansi where he got him, went up beside him and said, well, what is it? Anansi said, Tiger, look into that pool and tell me what you see. So Tiger looked, and he looked down. Wow, he said, that looks like a golden ball. He said, yeah. And Anansi was looking up at the sun. He said, yeah. And I'm sitting here trying to think, how can I get that golden ball? And then Tiger looked at Anansi, you, a miserable creature like you, expect that you can dive into this pool and bring up that gold? He said, yes, Tiger. Tiger said, look, don't be foolish. I am a great diver. I can go down there and I can bring up that gold. And Nancy said, but Tiger, if you bring up that golden ball, you won't share it with me. He said, you're jolly right, I won't, after all the tricks you pulled on me. And Nancy said, okay, Tiger, you've got me where you want me. Do whatever you want to do. Well now, Tiger took a deep breath, and he jumped from that rock, and he went into this pool. Meanwhile, Anansi was looking up at the sun above, and Tiger came up, shook himself. He said, and I said, Tiger, where's the gold? Tiger said, well, I didn't go far enough, but I'll go this time. Okay, Tiger, you go there and get the gold. So Tiger took another deep breath, and he dove, went down, and he went down, he went down. Tiger never came back up. Tiger went so far deep in that pool that he came out on the other side of the world in India. And that is why today there isn't a single tiger in Jamaica. They're all in India. Step on a pin, the pin will bend. And that's the way my story ends.
Please remember to subscribe. Please remember to subscribe, like, and share. And I will see you next time. Bye for now.